arrangements or other forms of engagement are less obvious, right? They're more I would say subtle in their approach, and are sharing a wider range at times of narratives, all in an effort to sort of shape the external environment. But the question then, this all leads to the question of just how effective any of this is, right? I mean, is it really shaping hearts and minds? Are people changing their viewpoints, having been exposed to some of these narratives time and again, whether in the form of sort of formal state media communications or otherwise? And I'd be curious in your thoughts about this. How is China being viewed in Chile, and how has that potentially changed over time? Your organization, ICLAC, right, has the monitor of a public opinion from 2023. I think you may have some 2024 findings. I don't know if those are out yet, and we can get a sneak peek. But I'd love to hear what you think about the effects of all of this, if any.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I had some notes for today, and I've been editing them, hearing the different discussions this morning and now, which I think makes it very interesting. I will talk a bit about Chile, but also thinking from a broader Latin American perspective, because Chile is a bit different from other Latin American countries in terms of economic exchange. And I wanted to talk about this sort of like what happens on the receiving end in a way, but also in historical perspective. I'll be brief, but there is, I would say, very limited knowledge about China in Chile specifically, and this is something I will come back to again and again and again. And when I think we can move on, then I come back to it again, and this has to do with a conditional visibility of the Chinese community. There is a long history of the Chinese community in South America, but you will still hear officials saying like, oh no, there's no Chinese community in Chile. So yeah, you have to come back to this information. And then also linked to the discussion today, there is a lack of Chinese language knowledge. And in a way, Confucius Institutes respond to this need. And I will come to this idea of responding to a need. Much prejudice and stereotypes, even at high-level education contexts. And I would say that there is a growing interest in Asia, from younger generations. But as a student said the other day, I am interested on things from Asia, but I don't know anything about Asian people. And she meant specifically Korea. And then we talked a bit about China as well, which was interesting. And then we can talk about this later, but I think there's some interesting case studies from Chile specifically on lessons learned that have to do with this lack of Chinese language knowledge, on prejudice and stereotypes, good and bad experiences, and that also we can compare with other foreign investment in Chile as well, and the reactions from the public opinion. And with that, I will move on. But before that, I want to emphasize that public opinion in Chile has moved certain decisions, either because there is government backing or there are some official policies, but public opinion does get topics to be discussed to get to parliament, for example. And then they are discussed and they go one way or the other, but public opinion does play a role. And that's why I think, and I will say communication and media, is interesting in terms of what role does it play when it comes to foreign direct investment, when it comes to China, and when it comes to other investors or actors in Chile specifically. Chile is specifically, there is a significant, let's say, economic and political relationship with China, specifically economic, because 40% approximately of Chile's exports go to China. So that is very saying in terms of economics. And there's no major infrastructure projects financed by China that have not been publicly bid. And Chile has had public bids since the 1990s. So in Chile, there's a tradition of foreign direct investment from public bids. Some have gone okay, most have gone okay. And then when it comes to China, we will see, because there are recent actors winning these public bids. And that includes, for example, the metro in Santiago, which is one that has been going on for a couple of years. And the bus, many of the bus routes in Chile have now been, it's a Colombian Chinese conglomerate that have won one of the bids, and we'll look at that. Overall in Latin America, and I'm quoting here Francisco Urdines, my colleague at ICLAC, he says there's an economic displacement by China of the US and European investors. And that's something that we have seen, and that I think plays a role here that we should be looking at in a context where there is a dream, a shared Latin American dream, I think, of to not be a commodity exporter, and then we continue being a commodity exporter. And this, I think, also plays a role regarding communication and information. So I will mention now this ICLAC survey of 2023. We interviewed, it was done by NetQuest, 660 people responded, and we are waiting for this year's wave. So it's a very sort of like preliminary results, but one can say that there is an overall favorable view of China and of China's investment and of China's role associated to commerce, to mall chinos as well, which is a specific kind of commerce of Chinese products that is present throughout Chile now, and also linked to economic growth, because copper is exported to China, and most, or let's say different actors in society, the state owns one of the big state-owned companies, exports copper to China, and you have the private sector that also is linked to the mining industry, and then it's jobs. So in that sense, it's seen as like positively, where interaction with Chinese people is through these Chinese malls and Chinese restaurants. Democracy is considered important regarding economic partners, but economic interest seems to be more important. So when it comes to democracy, we are interested in it, but then economic interest is more important, and that is quite clear. And when the results are also disaggregated by region locally, and there where there is more economic impact, mining regions, there's a tendency to think of China as an opportunity. So that's something that is also interesting. And when there is less economic impact, it appears more as a threat. And regarding politics, there is more sympathy on the left-leaning population, but for the right-leaning population, there is ideological pragmatism. So this also goes back to democracy, maybe. And there is a general agreement that there must be regulation regarding some essential economic areas, critical minerals, for example, but this is something that is not exclusive to China. And that's something that is interesting, because in many of the responses, and I mean, the data is there I can show you some information later, but I really want to see the second wave first, and I will come back to that, because this is just one picture. There's many reflections have to do on the role of China, but it is sometimes discussed in comparison to other countries. And yet, and this is what I think is also relevant, is that regarding China, there's a lot of racism and discrimination, and there's lots of denounces about it not being a democracy, for example. But when we have investment from other countries that could also be defined as not being a democracy, there is less, or there is no reaction in the press or the public opinion. So there is something that has to do with China, that is specific about China and the discourse around it. So just to like mention, Parsifal gave a good introduction of China, then we heard about Africa. Just to like discuss briefly Chile or Latin America, really. China has an interest in Latin America regarding media. But in our survey, that does not really show. There's not like that big of an impact regarding media. And in the last years, I would say in the last 5-6 years, there was a shift in the way Chinese media was present here through Xinhua, through agreements with newspapers, with inserts online, and that has not changed much, maybe until last year. And that's why I want to see what happens with the results this year. because there is collaboration between Xinhua and local radio, for example, in Chile, and I know that in Brazil, also with TV channels, some have been more successful than others. There's lots of documents in Spanish from Xinhua and similar outlets. But they, at least in the case of Chile, they do not seem to have permeated explicitly. In terms of implicit and self-censorship, that's something that I think one has to look at in more detail, and I cannot really comment. And yet, one can also see, and I'm adding like another like level to this, is that there is growing invitations to a broad spectrum of people to go to China, and there are many like delegations from parliament, from youth leaders, also from journalists, and there is more contact. And if you look at soft power and public diplomacy and people to people diplomacy, despite or disregarding what type of exchange it is, and if the image is negative or positive in the short term, in the medium and longer term, there is more knowledge and more exchange. And that makes it, I think, I'm thinking of the Cold War public diplomacy, for example, and how does that feed into today? One can see that a broader, like more contact with more people leads to a growth of soft power on the one hand, but at the same time, it also allows for a like clearer idea or let's say a broader spectrum of potential interpretations of what China is doing. So you have some like more critical views and less critical views, but in the long term, I think this will help to create more knowledge on China locally. And having said that, there are no journalists from Chile in China now working there or reporting there. So all like information is mediated either by international outlets or Chinese outlets. And that also like leaves a gap in terms of the knowledge that can be gotten from China. So I will just close, maybe going back to a word that was strongly used in the beginning of the 2000s, in 2005, when the free trade agreement was signed, and it was that China and Chile were both pragmatic in their relationship. Chile has a strong position regarding human rights because of the dictatorship and the role that Chile played in the 1990s. But pragmatism has been very strong regarding collaboration with China since 2005. And I would say there are also like nuances within political parties. I'm sorry if I'm very unclear, but I can develop on these later. Thank you.
No, not unclear at all. And I think it adds some new dimensions to this discussion that are worth exploring now that we're entering the Q&A. I have many questions. I don't know if there's anyone among the participants who would like to ask anything. And if you do, please go ahead and raise your hand and I'll call on you. But let me just go ahead. If I could ask Maria just a clarifying question on the survey that you mentioned. When you say that there's not much media engagement by China, or at least the sense that there is, that based on people's perceptions of whether China is heavily engaged in Chile's media environment, or is that based on a survey of actual content agreements or some other form of measurement?
No, we didn't. No, that has more to do on how much presence of Chinese media is actually in the press that is being read.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But what I would like to add to that is that communication has changed. And means of communication has changed. And TikTok is very popular in Chile.
Right.
And that brings a new actor into play on how and where people are getting information from. And in that sense, I think that what happens with communication is something that is relevant regarding China and beyond China, for sure.
Absolutely. We're facing a new wave and largely new approaches, right, to actually communicating some of these points. And that's one of the questions I want to pose to everyone, to all of our panelists. And thank you, Adam. I'll turn to you in just one second for putting that question in the comments. But I'd be curious. Parsifal, certainly you followed this to a considerable degree, and I think that both Dr. Dube and Dr. Oloo have a sense of this as well. But the mechanisms through which a lot of these narratives are being communicated have multiplied over time. We're seeing very creative new approaches to communicating some of these key concepts and some of the main points that Chinese media is trying to get across. And so I wonder if you have a sense of that, in the places where you're living or more broadly. We've moved beyond the era of purely op-ed placement on, the merits of China's approach to poverty alleviation. We have moved way beyond that to, now the express employment of wide-ranging influencers on TikTok to communicate some of these and other messages. And so I wonder if you have any concrete examples of how this is playing out across the media spectrum. Fine if not. And then a sort of secondary question to that is, what are we seeing in the way of top messages being communicated at the moment? This is kind of hard to get at it. It's a moving target, and we're doing a little bit of work at the dialogue trying to do some word frequency analysis, at least as concerns the official media, to understand how different narratives are evolving and what phrasing and rhetoric is being used at this moment that was perhaps not being used 5 years ago, how things are evolving in that respect. And I'm happy to share those details as well. But what really do you see as the narratives being promoted most extensively at this particular juncture? We mentioned a little bit, the what has been a top focus of China for a while, which is portraying itself as a fellow developing country. It's used the term global south many times, right? As advancing the position of emerging markets and other developing countries in the global economic order. Beyond that, are there other narratives that are being circulated and promoted with great frequency? And so I don't know if anyone would like to take either of these, either portion of this two-part question on first, or we can go. Yes, please, Margaret.
I will start briefly. Just one narrative that I think is interesting, that it comes from China, but that one can start to see in different ways in Chile at least, is sustainable development. And that is a very special, I think, topic in the sense that, like communication as a challenge for everyone, and media as a challenge for everyone, so is climate change, which knows no borders, right? So in a way, there's a challenge that is for everyone. And that's something that was discussed earlier this morning in the sustainable or transition panel. And the thing is that China has this big narrative on sustainable development. They have funding. They are offering, let's say, they are available for investment. In the case of Chile, they are providers of solar panels, of all kinds of things for renewable energies, eolic, steel, which has Chile closed one of its steel companies because of Chinese competition. And there's a big discussion there in the media as well. But energy transition needs batteries, and batteries need lithium. And lithium is in Chile as well, and Argentina, Peru. And what is going to happen with those places in terms of environment is a discussion that is still out there, and that there is no clear way of knowing which way to extract lithium that will have the lowest impact on the environment. So I think that there is an interesting conundrum, which I am not sure how to resolve, but is interesting in the sense that Chile wants to, has a project now with the COP and everything. There is this plan of our renewable energy and transition, and then we need lithium for that. So how we participate in that in relation to China as well is an interesting angle. And China has a project for this in terms of its narrative for a greener world in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Margaret. Parsifal?
Um, so, um, referring to current trends, I think it's worth highlighting because, as Maria mentioned, well, actually, I think the work being done by Maria and her colleagues at ICLAC in Chile, if it's not the first, at least it's the first comprehensive study in measuring or trying to measure the impact of Chinese messaging in in Latin America. The influence that they have, are there, as you mentioned, Margaret, I don't know how many people other than us will read one of those op-eds by a Chinese ambassador. But well, it's nice to know that there's growing interest, at least knowing from the Latin American side, if the messaging is actually getting through. Um, that being said, well, I think there's different publics for Chinese messaging. You have the elites, decision makers, who I think those broad concepts of um, of green transition, high quality development, are the target audience for that messaging, and that's why we actually that's where most of these op-eds tend to focus on, because at the end of the day, odds are if it's one of well, in Mercurio in Chile, where decision makers, elite politicians actually read this. It's at the end of the day, that's the target audience. And then you have the more general public, where I think these broad concepts and the traditional approach of using, state-owned media, CGTN, Xinhua, and others, uh, are basically not getting any traction. And I think this is represented in Maria's work, but at least at an anecdotal level, we don't see any traction of it. I would add that uh, I would not be surprised if in the coming years, precisely because of what I just mentioned of these local communications offices across different provinces in China, that there will be they will double down on the efforts of engaging. And when it comes to the general public, uh, I've followed several accounts of TikTokers or influencers across Latin America actually being, invited to China to talk about, how beautiful the country is, or being invited to the BYD plant or Alibaba headquarters. So I think that they've gotten the sense that their traditional approach wasn't working when it comes to changing, minds across the general public. And I would definitely not be surprised if we see a different approach going through a younger generation, a more tech-savvy approach, especially through social media and influencers.
I think that's an excellent point. And I mean, so much of China's policy is experimental, right? At least in its initial forms, and this is no exception, I think. And we do see different approaches over time and indeed geographically. I mean, different approaches in different places, depending upon what's happening and what the interpretation is of some of this messaging. Dr. Dube.
Thank you so much. So in terms of now with different approaches, previously it used to be mostly in the context of most African countries, it used to be mostly the state media that would report more on Chinese activities. But increasingly now there is also, reports that we see via the private media. Also, there's a contribution by civil society organizations that are mainly coming from the perspective of raising awareness on China activities in Africa, especially those from a human rights background that are, carrying out research, raising awareness around what is happening in the context of China, where, some civil society organizations actually engage communities through workshops or some forums or campaigns. There are some that specifically focus on the implications of foreign investment and encouraging grassroots participation in decision making. And some of these activities, make their way into, websites, or they are also picked up by the mainstream media, particularly the private media. So that component of the civil society conducting research and publishing reports also is one element I think that is very valuable, that has contributed to the China-Africa discourse. And also the use of the social media as well, which was not previously the case. Now, the social media platforms obviously making it possible for diversity of voices instead of, previously, I can give an example of in Zimbabwe, where you have Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation just reporting on Zimbabwe China relations, all our all-weather friend and all that, without feedback or without any contributions from the public. But right now you can actually see the exchange where the public also engages in discussions and responding to what they think about what the probably the state broadcaster, for instance, is reporting around the China in the country as well. So that helps in also, debunking some of the myths that might actually be perpetrated, especially as propaganda, and giving a bit more nuanced understanding of the China Africa relations. So that kind of activism that one sees playing out in social media is also another very important element to the perceptions around China. But when it comes to some of the top messages that we are seeing is in the way Africa, China is coming to Africa, or portraying itself in the context of Africa is being a development partner. So first and foremost, before we get into other things, it's mostly about, the investment, about development, sustainable development, where there's a lot of, reporting around significant, especially infrastructure projects that the Chinese, you'll find, many countries now have airports that have been refurbished, courtesy of the Chinese. If you go to Uganda, the road from the airport that is facilitating easy access into Kampala, China project. Even if you go to Nairobi as well, the expressway is a whole Chinese thing. So there is that reporting of the developments, particularly infrastructure, and around the Africa-China forum as well. There is a heightened reporting of Chinese presence in Africa by virtue of that activity taking place. But also, I think if I can reflect on the COVID-19 pandemic, there was that, I think, negative attitude towards the Chinese. Like, people were now looking at Chinese as, with resentment by virtue of, the narrative around how COVID-19 started or was spreading as well. That also was found in the African context, where people had that, negative perception around China and the Chinese. But basically, the main framing of China in Africa is mostly around the issue of development and how it's contributing, or also the issue of the geopolitical implications of China in Africa, particularly in relation to the Western powers and this just what we consider as Western powers and the strategic competition for influence also on the continent as well. So yeah, those are some of the issues, including the trade dynamics as well.
Thank you so much. Maria, did you have a two-finger on that?
Yeah, just a short comment. Following what Hlengiwe was saying, because COVID-19 here had the same effect. China was seen like in a bad way, even though we had Chinese vaccines. So that helped with the image of China, but still there was a very broad negative perspective on China because of COVID-19. And yet you can also hear sometimes from Chinese actors questioning where the COVID-19 came from and suggesting it could have been from the US, for example. So that is also, in terms of narrative, something that would be worth looking into. And also thinking of narrative, I would say that another strand of narratives regarding China here has to do with the role of the US in Latin America. So it was interesting to hear Hlengiwe saying about development as a development partner, because maybe here it has more to do as being a better partner than the US for Latin America. So that's also something that might be like a nuance between different spaces. And also I think that within Latin America, there's also nuances. For Brazil, I mean, Brazil is a huge economy, Chile is not. So there's also that like differences within Latin America. And also Latin America is going through its own events, let's say, and Venezuela, the crisis in Venezuela has been very strong for the rest of our Latin American countries. And it's occupying strongly day-to-day politics. And that has nothing to do with China. So you also have like that urgent kind of daily problems in relation to these like broader discourses. So I think it's interesting to look at those nuances.
Dr. Oloo, did you have anything you'd like to add to this?
Maybe, can I say something?
Please.
Yeah, in Kenya, the narrative that is going around is about green sustainable development. And this green sustainable development is just brought about on issues to do with the Chinese investment in terms of the construction of the SGR, that is standard gauge railway, as well as other roads and infrastructural facilities. But how are these propagated? It's only propagated currently when we have major events in China. For example, when there's FOCAC, that's when you'll see this kind of narratives start coming out. Last time they had this Belt Road initiative, we also saw some of these narrative coming out surrounding green energy, surrounding climate change, and issues with environmental protection. In terms of media, the question that we asked before, I realized that we have some specific kind of media which are able to propagate Chinese narrative. And some of these media majorly include the national broadcasters, but the private ones, the ones which publish a lot of Chinese messages, include one of the private media, but these media, it does so in terms of op-ed. And most of these op-eds are paid, they're paid op-eds. So when you compare like different media, then you realize that national broadcaster, specifically the radio and television, will be able to carry that. Then in terms of other broadcasters, private television stations and radio, they do not concentrate so much into Chinese stories. But some, in terms of now the print media, you realize that one or two media stations are the ones which propagate these. And this now therefore brings a question of policy, media policy issues, maybe in Africa or in Kenya specific, and how are we going to navigate around these concrete issues. So that is my comments towards that. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I wonder if it doesn't somehow, I mean, in terms of further research and classification, make sense to think about this a little bit in terms of, I mean, there are the general messages that China is looking to communicate about itself and its foreign policy and its foreign engagement, which seem to be pretty consistent over time, although we see different phrasing and different language used at different junctures. For a while, we were talking about UN conventions and the UN framework, and that's shifted somewhat and been replaced by more talk, so far as I can tell, in my non-scientific approach to looking at this, right? By a real focus on the development initiatives, right? On global development, or the global initiatives rather, global development initiative, global global, oh gosh, what are all of them? Security initiative and so on. But nevertheless, there's this there are these pervasive, narratives that we see globally. But then there are also those that are sort of opportunistic and suggestive of a particular shift in thinking about how best one ought to, or that China ought to communicate itself, and that this can be related to China's own economic and industrial policy making, and that a lot of these green development narratives are very much related to, I mean, certainly to interests in greening economies, but also to an export strategy, right? And so communicating an interest in green development is conducive also to the greater exportation of an investment in industries that China is promoting, because it sees them as being directly linked to its own economic development objectives, which are increasingly imperative, right? On the other hand, I mean, Maria, I take your point about the US, especially you see this in Latin America. I don't know if this is true of other regions, but there is an effort, especially on Twitter, but also in other forms of social media, to compare what China is doing to what the US is doing. And this really was, I saw this at really maybe reach a peak during the previous Trump administration, right? There, what we saw, at least when Trump was initially elected, was an extreme focus on multilateralism, noting that the US was unlikely to promote that to the same degree that it had in the past. And then also on other elements of US policy that China believed at the time and was accurate in its characterization that Trump would be, at least supporting less than we'd seen. And so I would imagine climate being one of those, right? So I would imagine, depending on the outcomes of the US election, that we'll see at least a slight, if not really extensive, shift in narrative about the US or about what China is looking to do in Latin America and other regions, not to put the US at the center of this, but there has been something of an effort to compare the two, just as you noted, Maria, and I've seen that as well. So I would say maybe there's one third category, and that's preemptive engagement. And I wonder if also, an uptick in sustainability related language is not also linked to the prospect of more potential challenges, confrontation and other issues that will be associated with much of the extractive activity underway, whether it concerns lithium or expanded gold mining or the other sorts of projects that are being pursued at present, in part because they're directly related to some of these new infrastructure innovation related industries. So to be determined, but I think a lot of this is directly related. Please, if anyone else has any questions, we have about 8 minutes left. I have a final question, which if you're willing, I'm happy to pose. Otherwise, I'll leave it to the audience. Any others as we? Okay. Oh, Juliana, did you have one? Did you? No. Okay. Maria, you mentioned this, and And I think it's a critical point about public opinion at times shaping outcomes, right? Policy outcomes. And certainly, I think Chile is one country where we potentially see this. It would be interesting to hear what specifically. I have a guess as to what you mean specifically by that, but I'd love to hear more about that and whether you see that happening in any real way in other parts of the region, Parsifal too, if you're seeing that happen in parts of Latin America, but Africa too. Is this something where we see real evidence of either a shift in public opinion or of public opinion in general affecting outcomes, whether vis-a-vis lending and future lending or project development. And certainly there have been efforts to halt projects on the part of civil society in Latin America, and others have been involved in project outcomes in one form or another. But broad public opinion, is that shaping the bilateral relationship and prospects for enhanced Chinese engagement in any real way? I'd be interested in any of your thoughts on this.
I will start briefly. In Chile, there is a history of halting projects, not Chinese, but a Canadian and a Chilean big project because of environment. So that has happened earlier. But when it comes to China, and this is which I find complex, is that there has been some problems regarding or questions regarding if it's a monopoly. And when that has been discussed by the National Office of Fiscalía Nacional Económica, sorry, I don't know the word in English, they have commented that there is that they can comment on monopoly, but not on geopolitics. That is not part of of what they do or that they want to do. So one discussion that I think Chile will have to face soon is to have a screening mechanism or not for foreign investment. And I always get asked my opinion. I won't give it publicly. No, but I think that is a question that needs to be done in Chile. And I think that the legal framework of Chile in general, beyond the screening mechanism, is something that needs to be looked into, because China has different characteristics than other direct investors that we have had in Chile before. And that's something that needs to be discussed. But with a lack of knowledge on China, then we need to go back and learn more about China. Public opinion does play a role through these elite outlets. And they have managed to either shift decisions or do investigations regarding specific businesses or agreements. So it does play a role. And even though I say that media has changed and TikTok and social media, I think that there is some an area that one should look into, what role public opinion plays and how and why, what are the motivations of public opinion, if it's personal interest or if it is really sustainable development.
Thank you. Parsifal.
Well, I cannot speak to public opinion, but recently I think there's a good example on, I cannot certify a cause and effect relationship, but definitely a correlation with elite decision-making in Colombia's case regarding the recent news that Colombia plans to join the Belt and Road Initiative. So in our own engagement with the Colombian Foreign Ministry over the last couple of years, we have seen a growing interest. I think this is finally the finale of those 2 years of very cautious approach to China at the high political level in Colombia. We know for a fact that they do follow, at least foreign ministry does follow more international foreign media, primarily Western, on China-related topics, not so much local, basically because there's no coverage in China or it's very limited. So they reach out to counterparts across the region. I know they've reached out to the Chilean government um, uh, to learn more about experiences. So I still think that the media landscape does, in its portrayal of negative portrayal of China, has had an influence in decision making. So even though they haven't agreed, that's also an important thing. They are thinking about it and they're making a bunch of consultations, and because they are very aware of the lack of understanding on the Colombian side about China, which speaks to what Maria was mentioning. They are very aware that they are at a disadvantage, but they want to make the best out of that decision without making this a problem with the United States. So media does play a role, but I think when it comes to China, it's more international, Western media more than local.
Without a doubt. Thank you so much. And Hlengiwe and Daniel, any final thoughts, whether on this or any other element of our conversation?
So, in terms of public opinion, in Kenya, it's a little bit different, where Kenyans able to raise their voices, calling the Chinese investors, calling the government, using different platforms. But again, what is currently happening, we are seeing situations where China has decided now to implement influencers. So we have now currently Kenyan influencers who are propagating Chinese messages. Unlike before, where they were using local media, so the shift has now changed, where basically they're doing public diplomacy, but again using the Kenyan influencers. So that is currently what is happening.
Fascinating. And then we leave you with 23 seconds. I'm so sorry, Dr. Dube.
It's okay for me. It's just to say thank you so much to the organizers and appreciating the opportunity to be part of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists, and really, really appreciate your fascinating contribution.